There's something about green eyes that has always resisted the tidy explanation we like to give it. We call blue eyes Scandinavian, brown eyes universal, and green eyes, what, exactly? Irish? Celtic? We gesture loosely toward northwestern Europe and leave it there. But anyone who has traveled far enough, who has looked into the pale jade eyes of an elder in Peshawar or the striking emerald gaze of a woman from the Caucasus, knows that this tidy story falls apart pretty quickly. Green eyes really are rare. Depending on which study you trust, somewhere between 2 and 8% of people on Earth have them. And they show up in places that seem to have nothing to do with each other. Ireland and Scotland, sure, but also Afghanistan, northern Iran, the Caucasus Mountains, and pockets across Central Asia. Two populations, separated by thousands of miles, different religions, different language families, almost no meaningful contact in the modern world, and yet the same striking eye color turns up in both. For a long time, this was filed away as coincidence, maybe convergent evolution, maybe just the random scattering of a common gene variant. But over the past 15 years or so, as genetic sequencing has gotten cheap and detailed enough to actually trace the fine structure of human pigmentation, a very different picture has come into focus. It turns out the story of green eyes isn't about one gene or one migration. It's about two populations, Europeans and people from West and Central Asia, who turn out to share an ancient genetic signature that almost nobody expected to find connecting them. That connection upends a lot of what we assumed about how eye color tracks with ancestry, and it says something bigger about how thin the categories are that we use to sort people. What we thought we knew. Popular science, and honestly a lot of outdated textbooks, made eye color sound simple. One gene, brown dominant, blue recessive, green somewhere in the middle as a kind of heterozygous compromise. Students drew their Punnett squares and moved on with their lives. The real picture, mapped out through modern genome-wide studies, is far messier and far more interesting. At least 16 different genes contribute to eye color in some meaningful way. Two of them, OCA2 and HERC2 on chromosome 15, do most of the heavy lifting on the blue versus brown spectrum. There's a specific genetic switch inside HERC2, the variant researchers label RS129-13832, that acts like a dimmer for OCA2. When someone inherits the newer version of this switch on both chromosomes, OCA2 activity drops sharply, melanin production in the iris collapses, and the eyes come out blue. Two copies of the older version, and brown eyes are almost guaranteed. Green sits between those two outcomes, but not as a simple in-between blend. It's the product of a much more delicate recipe, a moderate, not extreme, drop in iris melanin, specific structural qualities in the collagen fibers of the iris that scatter blue light through the same physics that makes the sky blue, a small amount of a yellow-brown pigment called lipofusin, plus contributions from several supporting genes like SLC24A4, TYR, IRF4, and possibly TYRP1. Genetically, it's a narrow window. Too much melanin loss and you land on blue. Too little and you're back to brown. Green is the thin band in between, which is exactly why it's uncommon. A map that refused to behave. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange. When researchers started plotting pigmentation genes across large population databases, the UK Biobank, Iceland's Decode project, Dutch and Danish cohorts, they expected a smooth gradient, lightest eyes up north, darkest near the equator, everything blending gradually in between. That model works fine for blue eyes. The blue eye variant appears to have originated somewhere around the Black Sea or the Pontic-Caspian steppe, then spread outward with early European farmers, and later with steppe herders who carried it deep into Central and Northern Europe. Green eyes didn't play along. In Europe, they cluster in a band running from Ireland through Scotland and Wales, into northern France, the Low Countries, Iceland, and Western Scandinavia. Genetically, European green eyes line up with particular combinations of OCA2 and HERC2 that produce partial, rather than complete, pigment loss. They also correlate with SLC45A2, a gene tied to lighter skin and eyes generally, and with MC1R, the gene famous for red hair and freckle-prone skin across Atlantic Europe. In other words, Green eyes in this region are just one thread in a much larger web of light pigmentation genes that evolved together under strong pressure in the low sunlight environments of high-latitude Europe over roughly the last 10 to 15,000 years. Ancient DNA backs this up. Samples pulled from Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites, burials in Ireland's Carrickmore and Rathlin Island, along with Mesolithic remains from Iberia, show that partial pigmentation variants were already present, sometimes at real frequency, well before anything we'd recognize as Celtic or Irish culture existed. The stereotype of the green-eyed Irishman does have real genetic footing. It's just vastly older than Irish or Celtic identity itself. 4,000 miles east. Now shift the picture entirely. Travel from eastern Turkey through Georgia and Armenia into the North Caucasus, then curve south and east through northern Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan's tribal regions. Green eyes show up here at rates that match, or beat, Ireland's. Among Pashtuns, a tribal population numbering somewhere near 50 million, estimates put green eye frequency anywhere from 15 to over 20% in some tribal groups. Among Chechens, Circassians, Abkhaz, and other North Caucasian peoples, green and hazel-green eyes are common, frequently paired with dark hair, a combination almost never seen in northwestern Europe. Among the Nuristani of northeastern Afghanistan, a population small enough that even Alexander the Great's own chroniclers apparently remarked on their light eyes, green may be the single most common shade. For years, the go-to explanation was romantic and basically made up. Descendants of Alexander's soldiers, stray Greek settlers, wandering crusaders, leftover Roman garrisons. Great campfire stories. Almost none of it holds up genetically. When teams from Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, working alongside European genomics labs, began sequencing Pashtun, Kalash, and Nuristani genomes in the early 2010s, the whole framework shifted. These populations do carry some of the same key functional variants at the OCA2-RGC2 site that Europeans carry for green eyes. Same underlying mechanism. But the genetic material surrounding those variants, the stretch of DNA inherited alongside them, tells a completely different story. In these West and Central Asian populations, that surrounding chromosome 15 sequence split off from the European version deep in prehistory. Depending on the method used, that split is estimated at somewhere between 25 and 40,000 years ago, not a recent shared ancestor. Not medieval contact, something far older than either of those. I'll admit my first instinct on reading this was convergent evolution. Two unrelated populations independently landing on similar mutations. That would have been the clean answer. But the molecular evidence doesn't support it. These variants aren't just similar by chance. They're identical by descent. Too much shared surrounding sequence for that to have happened twice, independently, by coincidence. The odds of that degree of overlap arising separately are essentially nil. What the data actually points to is a single ancestral population, likely somewhere near the Caucasus, the Iranian Plateau, or the broader zone geneticists sometimes call the ancient North Eurasian sphere, that carried these intermediate pigmentation variants before European and West Central Asian ancestors split apart. The green eye gene, in other words, is a leftover from a time before European and Asian meant anything genetically. It's a trace of the Upper Paleolithic, carried forward separately by two branches of humanity that went on to build entirely different worlds. A 2021 Max Planck study on Bronze Age Central Asian DNA added another layer. Looking at steppe-adjacent burials, Bronze Age settlements in the Bactria Margiana region of modern Turkmenistan, and early farming communities on the Iranian plateau, researchers found green eye-linked DNA at meaningful frequency across this whole corridor, in populations ancestral to both modern Europeans and modern South and Central Asians. The trait wasn't flowing in one direction. It was spreading outward from a broad central zone, west into Europe alongside Anatolian farmers and later Yamnaya migrations, and east and south into Central and South Asia along entirely different paths. Same roots, different stories. Here's the part that really matters. Despite sharing that deep common origin, European and West Central Asian green-eyed populations have followed wildly different evolutionary paths for at least 20,000 years. Same ancestry at the root, completely different mechanisms since. In Europe, light pigmentation came under intense selection starting in the Mesolithic and speeding up through the shift to farming. The driving pressure was mostly about vitamin D synthesis in a low sunlight, high-latitude environment, possibly worsened when grain-heavy diets replaced fish and game. Blue and green variants spread fast. Population models suggest some of these alleles went from rare to nearly universal in under 5,000 years, which only happens under strong selective pressure. Green eyes rode along with this broader lightning package that reduced melanin across skin, hair, and eyes together because it offered a real survival edge at northern latitudes where sunlight is scarce. In West and Central Asia, none of that applies. UV exposure is higher, even at altitude, so vitamin D pressure is weaker. Skin stays relatively dark or olive-toned, and yet green eyes persist at 20% or more in some isolated mountain communities. So what's keeping the trait alive without the vitamin D driver? Two forces seem to be doing the work. First, plain genetic drift in small, isolated mountain populations. The Caucasus and the Hindu Kush chop people into tiny, cut-off communities, a few hundred or a few thousand people, separated by valleys that are genuinely hard to cross. In groups, that small random chance can push a rare gene up in frequency fast, and repeated crashes from war, famine, or disease only amplify the effect. Second, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me, there's solid evidence of sexual selection actively maintaining light eyes in these communities. Studies on partner preference in Pashtun communities in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and among Chechen families in the North Caucasus, conducted during the 2010s, found a real, measurable preference for light eyes, green specifically, in choosing a partner. This isn't village gossip. These are structured studies with quantified results, and the effect sizes are large enough that, compounded across generations, they could plausibly push the trait well above what drift alone would produce. Pashto and Chechen poetry and folk song both single out green eyes, specifically as an ideal of beauty, not blue, not gray. A cultural preference like that, sustained for centuries, becomes its own selective force. So the same physical trait ends up preserved by completely different mechanisms. Natural selection tied to sunlight in one region, drift and mate choice in the other, both building on the same ancient genetic starting point. The Kalash. One more thread worth pulling before we tie this together. The Kalash of Pakistan's Chitral district are a tiny population, around 4,000 people, who practice a distinct polytheistic religion unlike their Muslim neighbors, and who are known for unusually high rates of green and blue eyes paired with light brown hair. Geneticists originally assumed this meant significant European mixing. Sensational reports in the 1990s claimed they were descended from Alexander's army or some preserved Indo-European tribe. When their genomes were finally sequenced properly, a landmark study published in 2015 in the American Journal of Human Genetics, the truth turned out to be quieter and more interesting. The Kalash show no meaningful recent European ancestry at all. Their light eye variants are ancient, connected to Europeans only at that same deep shared root described above, and kept at high frequency through extreme isolation, strong in-group marriage, and repeated population bottlenecks that amplified rare variants through drift. They aren't misplaced Europeans or Alexander's descendants. They're a living snapshot of what Central Asian populations may have looked like before the massive genetic mixing events of the Bronze and Iron Ages blended much of the region together. What it actually means. So what does it mean that a grandmother in Jalalabad and a fisherman in Galway carry the same ancient genetic marker for eye color, one that traces back to a population that existed before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before any religion or ethnicity practiced today? First, it means appearance is a remarkably poor stand-in for recent ancestry. Green eyes don't make someone European, and they don't make someone Central Asian. They mark someone as a carrier of a genetic variant older than either category. The next person who assumes a green-eyed Afghan child must have European blood is wrong. Not because there's no connection, but because that connection runs so deep that European stops being a meaningful label at that depth. Second, it means our habit of reading surface traits as evidence of close relatedness rests on a pretty basic misunderstanding. The same gene, sitting on different genetic backgrounds, shaped by different pressures, in populations with no significant contact for tens of thousands of years, can still produce the same visible outcome. Looks are about the shallowest measure of relatedness there is. Two green-eyed strangers from opposite continents might actually share less overall DNA than a green-eyed person and their brown-eyed neighbor down the street. Third, it means the divisions we treat as ancient and fixed, clean continental groups with distinct looks, are much younger and far leakier than they feel. The genes remember a time before those lines were drawn. Every generation carries forward molecular evidence of a shared chapter that no story, scripture, or cultural memory ever recorded. So the next time you look into a pair of green eyes, in a mirror, across a table, or in a photo from the other side of the planet, you're looking at one of evolution's cleanest demonstrations of just how deep our shared past actually runs. The color itself isn't Eastern or Western. It's simply old. Older than any civilization, any religion, any confident line we've ever drawn between us and them. The genes were never keeping track of our borders. They never will.